This is Agriculture Today. I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. Ahead of us today on this Monday's programming, we start with our cattle market update for the week, provided this week by Livestock Marketing Information Center Director Katelyn McCullock. She provides information on the latest cattle on feed report and crop production report. Also ahead, K-State Nutrient Management Specialist Dorivar Ruiz Diaz shares information on applying lime to alfalfa and why ongoing drought conditions may cause producers to apply earlier than usual this year. We end with this week's wildlife segment with K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Specialist Joe Gerken. He covers best practices for preparing ponds for the upcoming fall. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are returning with our first segment of the week as always, which is our cattle market update. And to cover that, we have with us Katelyn McCullock. She's the director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center out of Colorado. So Katelyn, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Samantha.
Absolutely. So let's start, as we always do, with our kind of generals of the market. What did the cash market show this week?
Well, on the Fed side, we held 146 through Friday. Still a very relatively strong cash price by historical standards. Quite a bit of a spread still between southern and northern plains. Not sure if that will work itself out here through the end of the year or not, but still overall that 5-area price still very strong for steers and heifers. On the cash side for feeder cattle, your Dodge City auction had a pretty wide spread so far in August. So if you look at 5 to 550 weights or 5 to 600 weights, that's about a $20 spread between this week and last week. So it looks like the 550s came down about $20 a hundredweight, and the 550 to 6s came up about $10. So a little bit of choppiness in that area. When you flip back to the 7 to 8s, those held actually relatively firm around 178, so up a little bit from the previous week, which was closer to 175. But still pretty strong prices you're looking at across the feeder cattle auctions as well.
Good. And then in terms of futures, any major changes there?
The Fed cattle futures ended last week up a little bit. Some pretty good highs closed in for that December contract. And if you flip forward to 2023, all of those were in the green. Feeder cattle did lose a little bit of ground. Corn ended the week up a little bit when they lost, about half a dollar per hundredweight or so. And on most of the deferred contracts, a little bit less in that August-September contract. But generally speaking, throughout the year, you're looking at feeder cattle prices on the board. It's still in the high 180s from now to the end of the year, and even getting a little bit better after that. So very, very promising prices there.
Good. So some optimism there in the market when we're thinking about that. What does boxed beef really show? I know we're getting to the months where summer's starting to collapse away from us and we're getting into the fall. So anything we can anticipate there?
Very quiet week last week. We've held at this 265, 264 range. So not a lot of excitement. One thing we like to look at is the spread between different quality grades. And you're seeing that prime value across the rib and loin primals really pop up as we head into that fourth quarter. That's where that spread usually really elongates from like a branded product or a choice product. And so that's giving me, I guess, optimism towards the beef market heading into the fourth quarter, that we still aren't seeing maybe a drag on consumer demand because of these high prices.
And then I know our recent cattle on feed report was dropped here. Anything worth mentioning there?
So cattle on feed came out on Friday. This is for the July data that came out. So as of August 1 for cattle on feed, up a little bit, 11.2 million, about 200,000 head higher than a year ago. Probably the biggest surprise or takeaway was that placements were actually up in July. So most of the pre-report analysts were thinking that it was going to be below a year ago. That pre-report average was closer to about 1% down. And a lot of that's factoring in drought placements. If you look across the southern plains, we only get a handful of states in terms of the cattle on feed report. But generally speaking, placements were more than 20% higher than a year ago in the state of South Dakota and Oklahoma. Strong growth in Texas, though, up 7%. And And if you look across the weight breakdowns, that's only available for 4 states, Texas, Nebraska, Kansas, and Colorado. Compared to a year ago, total U.S. placements were about 410,000 versus 375 last year for under 600 pounds. Texas, though, that was about a 30,000 head bump from a year ago. In the 6 to 699 category for the U.S. sat at about 280,000 compared to 255 last year. Only about a 5,000 head bump in Texas that year. But I definitely think that increase in placements, we were thinking it was going to be a little bit closer to a year ago. So strong numbers still coming in there. That has to be because of the dryness you've seen. But as I hear it, you guys are expecting a little bit of rain in the coming weeks, and hopefully that'll help out some of that region.
Yeah, I think some of that rain we were anticipating is actually going to be a little bit further south from us here in Kansas, unfortunately. Great for Oklahoma, not so great for our friends in southwest Kansas. But we got a little bit of rain here recently in Manhattan, which is great. But of course, the rest of the state needs some love as well. And of course, like you mentioned, Texas also experiencing some major drought conditions in part of that state as well. So of course, a major impact there too. And then in terms of another report that came out, our crop production report was recently released. And that, of course, has major implications for our cattle market as well.
The August report is really special because it's the first look you have at intended yields and possibly production numbers for the crop year. It is mostly satellite data and farmer survey, so it's not actually utilizing objective yields, but it's still that first initial look that we get at the corn crop, the soybean crop, and the hay production crop, which are the things I care about as a livestock economist. So we'll start with corn. Corn yields were eased a little bit lower, 175.4 versus the 177 that was initially listed from on trend. Price projection there was largely left the same. They're expecting a 665 season average price. We're actually a little bit higher than that. So I would expect that maybe to push up a little bit because I think those yields might deteriorate a little bit further. Soybean yield looked good, 51.9 bushels per acre, about half a bushel higher than the initial estimate. Acres were reduced by about 300,000, and your estimated demand production number was about 2% higher than last year. Still very strong prices, though, in the soybean complex. They're looking at a season average price of $14.35, which is very strong. The real shock, though, for hay producers, or maybe not a shock because they've been enduring these high hay prices for so long, was that hay production seems to be reducing even further. So the August crop production report estimated that the U.S. nationally is facing about a 4.6% drop in other hay, so that's non-alfalfa varieties. Texas expected to see a 29% drop in production. Oklahoma down 15%. Missouri 16% down. Kentucky down 18%. Arkansas down 23%, Georgia down 25%. I mean, these are big double-digit declines. Specifically related to Texas, though, Texas is the number one other hay-producing state in the country. So to see that drop 29%, talking about a large volume of loss, that's probably going to have a ripple effect towards other states. On the alfalfa side, a little less of a game changer, only expected to dip about 145,000 tons, which is less than 0.5% from last year. But some states also showing some pretty big double-digit losses, and the ones I'd key in on are Colorado, down 36% from a year ago, and Nebraska down 35%. Now, we've had high to record high prices almost for 2 years now, where the last agricultural prices nationally put hay prices in July was alfalfa was listed at $245, I believe, per ton. So if you think about the last annual record high was $211. In the 2000, I think, 11, 12, 13 type time period. We're going to blow that out of the water. We're probably going to see record high alfalfa prices and probably much, much higher than that on a season average price. On other hay, we're sitting at 146 in June. Sorry, these are June. So we're going to get July here at the end of August. But these are, again, national hay prices. That's probably a little bit under where the previous record high is, but we expect that price to remain in that 150 type of range for most of the year. Last year, we averaged about a 145, so we're hanging in there right now, but I would expect that price to move higher nationally, especially with these kind of production numbers being put out early. And one caveat I would add is that this August data can change, so we'll get objective yields in October, and they'll keep revising it, and then the final kind of revision for the year will be in January. And then, of course, there's the 5-year census revisions that will come out with the next ag census.
Absolutely, yeah. We've mentioned before on the program kind of the instability that comes with August reports somewhat, because like you said, it's kind of a preview of what we're guessing was to come, but not really boots on the ground showing that quite yet. But a bit more stability to hopefully come in September and knowing those numbers. But hay availability, of course, a major concern. And of course, that affects our markets in a not so positive way when availability is so low.
It's been tight for most of the Western U.S. for 2 years now, and this is going to set us up for an even worse situation from that perspective. And especially when you think about how pasture and range conditions have deteriorated, the carrying capacity is not there. You need to supplemental feed in a lot of the country. And so it is a very big concern, not just for buying hay right now, but what do you have on hand over the winter? What is available for you to buy on hand over the winter? It's a little bit of a perfect storm. We've been saying that now for consecutive years, and the hay situation doesn't appear like it's going to get any better, at least in the near term.
Absolutely. So definitely stretching our producers a bit in terms of how resilient they can be in these sort of conditions. But Katelyn, as always, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Once again, that was Katelyn McCullock. She's the director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center based out of Colorado, covering this week's cattle market update. Coming up still on this Monday's program, advice as to why producers may want to consider applying lime a bit earlier than usual this year. That coming from K-State Nutrient Management Specialist Dorivar Ruiz Diaz. Also ahead, K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Specialist Joe Gerken covers this week's wildlife segment. He goes over best practices for preparing ponds for the upcoming fall. Once again, that and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are going to be covering now lime applications in alfalfa. And to cover the subject, we have with us Dorivar Ruiz Diaz. He is our nutrient management specialist here at K-State. So Dorivar, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So like I said, we're going to be covering lime applications, which is an area that goes unnoticed by producers a lot of the time. And one of those reasons is soil acidity isn't something that producers are commonly reminded about.
That's a good point, Samantha, and I think that's one thing that we need to emphasize, especially when we're talking about crops like alfalfa, a legume that's very sensitive to acidic soils. And before we start, I think one of the things I wanted to kind of just give a little quick overview of what is pH and acidic soils. We're really talking about the concentration of hydrogen in the soil, right? And so when we have high hydrogen concentration, basically we have acidic soil. So how do we fix that problem? Basically need to apply lime, which is calcium carbonate. And the main reaction, the chemical reaction there is really that carbonate neutralizing the hydrogen. And so I just wanted to talk about this because one of the key points here is that it's not really calcium that's affecting the pH, it's the carbonate that's affecting the pH. And this is important when, for example, we are applying amendments like gypsum, calcium sulfate, which has no carbonates. In that case, basically, again, gypsum has no effect on pH. And so I think that's something to keep in mind and why lime is so important as a calcium carbonate, because that carbonate is the one that's going to be affecting the pH. And again, going back to alfalfa in particular, again, is a very sensitive to acidic soil. One of the key components there is the nodulation and nitrogen fixation that can be affected. So oftentimes if you have acidic soil in alfalfa, you tend to see kind of a yellow, a nitrogen deficient, essentially, crop. And the reason for that is because the nodules are not working due to that acidic soil.
Absolutely. So something very specific to legumes, which I know alfalfa is probably the main one that you guys grow across Kansas, but something I'm familiar with being from Alabama with peanuts, but something to keep in mind for sure. So when it comes to pH and targets for where soil acidity should be at, are there different regions of the state that have different target pHs, or are they all the same?
Yes, that's an excellent point. And in our case in Kansas, yes, we do have different target pHs. And essentially we can think about two main regions, east of the Flint Hills and then basically west Kansas. And why is this different? Essentially, when we are east of the Flint Hill, we can have some situations where the subsoil is also acidic. And so in that situation, we need to be looking at a target pH that is slightly higher, basically to compensate for that potential subsoil acidity that we may have. And so typically, if we are in east of the Flint Hill for alfalfa, we would like to have a target pH of at least 6.8. So that's much higher than what we would like to see in other parts of the state. Now, if we are west of the Flint Hills, then we can be okay with any pH that's going to be above 6.0. So 6.0, that's the target. Anything below that, we need to be thinking about liming. One advantage, of course, west of the Flint Hill is that the subsoil will tend to be higher in pH. We have basically carbonates as we go deeper in the profile. And so, again, that's the advantage there. So we need to think about those two main regions, essentially, for pH.
Absolutely. And then when it comes to calculating rates of application, what are some methods producers can keep in mind when doing that?
Yes, and this is where essentially the quality of the lime comes into play, and we really need to be thinking about pounds of effective calcium carbonate. And when we think about effective calcium carbonate, there are two factors that comes into play. One of those is the purity of that material, and the other component is how fine is the material. So based on those two factors, we basically estimate the effective calcium carbonate value of that lime source. And again, this can vary a lot, and so this is very important to keep in mind, and that's the reason why we use units of effective calcium carbonate, so we are able to compare different sources of lime, because different sources are going to be different in terms of fineness, in terms of purity. We have other sources like pale lime, pelletized lime, for example, that tends to be a very pure form, obviously a very effective form. But other sources will be just as effective as long as we are taking into account the effective calcium carbonate value of that particular source. One of the things also that we need to keep in mind here is that lime is not very soluble usually. And so, again, fine materials are going to be more effective. The other factor is moisture. And this comes back to planning ahead for alfalfa in particular. If we're thinking about planting alfalfa in the fall, we need to be making decisions right now about lime application, because we do need time for that lime essentially to react, and especially moisture is going to be one of those key factors. And with the dry conditions we have lately, this may actually take even longer for that lime to react with the soil. And so that's something to keep in mind, again, as we are planning ahead and making sure we have plenty of time for that lime to react and neutralize the acidity.
When it comes to sourcing their lime, I know there are several types of lime that can be utilized. Tell us a little bit about those types.
Yes, and that's an excellent point. The most traditional one is the calcitic limestone, which is basically calcium carbonate. But there's also the dolomitic limestone, which is basically magnesium. And so there's always questions about this, which one may be better. And when it comes to pH as a source of lime, there's really no difference. Both are going to be effective. Again, as we mentioned, it's really the carbonate component that is acting to neutralize the acidity. So from that standpoint, really, there's no difference. If there's any need for additional calcium or perhaps magnesium application as a crop nutrient, then that could be a different situation. But typically in Kansas, we have plenty of calcium and magnesium in our soils. Those are usually not the limiting factor for us in our soils in Kansas. Really what we're focusing on here is the carbonate, the liming effect, basically. And both calcitic and dolomitic limestone are going to be effective.
Absolutely. In terms of affordability, is there a difference between the two?
I think the key point is really what's available. And it's possible that distance to the lime source is going to have an effect here, and the cost is going to be basically driven by the location and the source of lime. And so I think that will be one of the main factors, and I will pay more attention to that, what's going to be readily available to the specific location.
Absolutely. Good to keep in mind for sure. So some of the considerations there, you mentioned kind of the label, I guess?
Yes, and this is a very good point, because actually the effective calcium carbonate value of lime is actually something that is expected by the Kansas Department of Agriculture. And so that information should be available basically from the different lime sources. And essentially, for example, if we are purchasing pale lime, that's going to be in the label for sure.
Excellent. Well, good to know and good for producers to keep in mind because like you said, if this is something they're considering with drought conditions that we're experiencing, they need to start acting on this now for sure.
Yes. And again, the earlier the better in this case, especially for alfalfa. One of the other things, too, that we need to keep in mind is what about the application methods, right? The timing, of course, we need to give plenty of time for that lime to react. And again, with dry conditions, it may take even a couple months for that reaction to happen. So it is important. But the other factor as well is how we are putting the lime. And we have basically two situations. One of them will be for no-till systems and another one for conventional tillage. In the case of conventional tillage, obviously, we do have the opportunity to incorporate that lime, which is going to be sort of the traditional approach where we're putting that lime, we are incorporating, we're putting the full rate, incorporate, and give time for that lime to react. However, we may be dealing with a no-till system where obviously we are not going to be able to incorporate the lime. In that situation, there are some things that we need to keep in mind. And one of those is that the rate of application will essentially be half of the full rate. And the reason for that is because the lime will only be interacting with the upper 2 or 3 inches in the soil. Okay, and so I think that's one of the key points we need to consider here, because one of the potential risks is that if we are going too high with the lime application, we can also over-apply and essentially increase the pH too much and cause some other nutrient tie-up problems, especially micronutrients. And so again, that's something to keep in mind, where is going to be the approach in terms of incorporation, how deep we are planning to incorporate that lime. And again, in the case of no-till, we definitely need to be thinking about cutting back that rate and planning for that upper 2 or 3 inches.
If producers are looking for more information, if they're like, well, I need to get on this now, where can they find that at?
Yes, we do have an article recently that touches all of these, basically in the agronomy e-updates that just came last week. And so that's one place to start. And we do have additional information also, publications available also mentioned in that article that would be an excellent source to look at as we are planning for lime.
Absolutely. And then I know we tend to talk about this a lot, but of course soil testing is, of course, very important when it comes to this, correct?
Yes, and this is absolutely all what we're talking about here is going to be, first step is going to be doing that soil testing, find out what's the pH, whether that's going to be an issue. Actually, the buffer pH is going to be another key component that we ultimately use basically to also estimate the rate of application. So it's both the pH and the buffer pH, as well as other nutrients. And again, thinking about alfalfa overall, it's a very expensive crop to establish. So we really need to do a homework and make sure we are taking care of all the nutrient needs, especially phosphorus, potassium. And the basic thing is really pH. Take care of all of that before we establish the alfalfa. It's really very unfortunate to see newly established alfalfa fields that have some problems due to pH or nutrient deficiencies. And again, in that case, oftentimes there's little we can do after the alfalfa is already established.
Absolutely. So starting on a strong start is always important. And if producers are looking to reach out to local extension agents about this subject, is that something you encourage?
Absolutely. This is something that I will encourage to talk to the local agents, especially if we're thinking about submitting samples. For example, they can help with that process, especially for the K-State Soil Testing Lab.
Well, Dorivar, as always, we thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Once again, that was Dr. Dorivar Ruiz Diaz. He is a nutrient management specialist here at K-State, covering lime applications in alfalfa. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are back now for our final segment on Mondays, and that is our wildlife segment for the week. And to cover that this week, we have with us Joe Gerken. He is a fisheries and aquatics specialist here at K-State. So, Joe, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me back. It's an exciting day, first day of the semester. It's always fun to have.
Yes, it is the first day of the semester. Welcome back to students for sure. That's awesome. But today we're going to talk about changing seasons, which is appropriate for the start of the fall semester. Also the start of just fall in general.
We're out of the dog days, the really hot days of summer. We're still probably have a couple of those pop up, but we're starting to think about our ponds. What do we need to do as we get into a little bit cooler season? So that's what we're here. We're going to chat for a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So first and foremost, I know you've been getting a few calls about some concerns over bigger fish dying.
Yeah. So this time of year, it's kind of the ponds are at the hottest temperature they're going to be, and hot water, warmer water holds less oxygen. So this time of year, you can have events that plummet oxygen levels, and big fish need more oxygen than little fish, so you can start to see big fish die. And that's a concern for people, obviously. So you just kind of want to monitor, make sure if you start to see fish gulping at the air, trying to breathe, that's an indication that we don't have enough oxygen in our water. We'd want to get some agitation, try to mix it up a little bit to help them out. So end of summer, that's kind of, we want to make sure we get over that hump and keep all the fish happy and healthy in our pond that we can.
But when it comes to some of the other things people should be doing in terms of preparing their ponds, I know that, as seasons change, the leaves off trees fall, things like that. Is that a concern?
Yeah, so when we think about ponds, vegetation entering our pond, leaves falling into our pond, that's all nutrients. And so we want to make sure that we get as much of that out as we can. So any vegetation that we don't want, whether that's plants that have been growing in our ponds that are beginning to die, we want to get as much of that vegetation out of our pond and out of our watershed as possible. Leaves falling from trees into our pond, we want to make sure we clear some of those out. Otherwise, they're just going to go to the bottom and compost. And if they compost, they're going to make weeds. And then we'll be on here in the spring talking about how to get rid of all the weeds we have in our pond. So
absolutely. So staying ahead of it now so you don't have to deal with the consequences later.
That's right. So those are some easy steps to kind of get ahead of the game, set yourself up for a productive spring.
Absolutely. And then in terms of maintaining the health of our ponds when we go into the winter, the cooler months, maintaining feeder fish, I know, becomes a bit more of a struggle, right?
Yeah, so how we're feeding fish. Not everyone feeds their fish, but if we are feeding our fish, we want to make sure we stop feeding our fish when water temperatures hit about 50 degrees or so. If we keep feeding them after that, they just don't eat very much. Fish are cold-blooded, so they're going to slow down when the water's cold. And if we're still putting food in there, that's nutrients that are settling out, and that's just going to be nutrients that encourage growth next spring for plants and weeds. So we want to make sure we get ahead of that. Stop feeding your fish when the water temperature hits about 50 degrees or so.
Sure, and when that water temperature changes, should we experience, frost by that point, or freezing temperatures for it to be that cool in the water, or what should we anticipate?
So water's obviously going to change its temperature slower than air, but we need to see some consistent days where, it's getting down, probably around frosting time is roughly when you need to think about taking feeders out. Things are going to slow down enough that we want to think about our pond kind of slowing down its process and making sure we're not adding any nutrients that time of year.
So nothing in the month to come to anticipate needing to do that, but maybe more so in October, towards the end of October and getting into November.
We have a couple months still. I'm trying to get ahead of things so we can think about what do we need to do a month or 2 months from now so we can be all set up and make sure we're doing the things we need to do to our pond to have a productive spring.
If people are looking for more information on what they need to do to prepare for this fall, where can they find that information at?
Sure. I always recommend starting with your local extension office. So reach out to them, talk to them. You can reach out to us at the Wildlife Specialists, so we're happy to help out as we can. And then Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks has a lot of resources as well. So those three resources are kind of where I'm going to push people to get ideas on how to make sure we have a successful overwinter and a successful spring for our ponds.
Awesome. Well, Joe, as always, we thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Once again, that was Joe Gerken. He is our K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Specialist covering this week's wildlife segment. That concludes today's programming. We'll be back with more tomorrow on Agriculture Today.